like to say a little bit about the person that the lectureship is named after. And I think one of the most critical pieces that I would say about the speaker, Larry Adair, would be that this effort, this lectureship, the sponsorship today came about because of support of friends in 2004. It speaks very well when you look around and there are people that you know in life, people that have had an impact. I see Senator Wilson here and others. But when other people step up and they contribute not only time, but they contribute money to honor you for your service, and in fact, in an attempt, in an effort to create good citizens and have dialogue for that, that speaks volumes of you, Speaker Adair, that we continue because of what you started quite some time ago and people that supported you. So we're so glad that we're here. We're certainly glad that you're here. We're so and that Jan is here with you. Yes. The Larry Adair Lectureship Series is really designed to promote dialogue about politics, public policy, and really how do we create good citizens, engaged citizenry. So on behalf of NSU, I thank you and the friends for making it happen. And with that, I'd like to introduce one of the Larry Adair scholars, Taylor Eversole, and she will introduce our speaker. Again, good morning and welcome. And Richard, we're so glad you're here also. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. We're so excited to have Richard Preston at NSU today to talk about some very timely topics, including Ebola and other biological threats. Mr. Preston is the best-selling author of The Hot Zone, which introduced the world to the Ebola virus and other rainforest viruses. Since then, he's written books on the anthrax attacks in 2001, biological terrorism, and most recently, he co-authored the book Micro with Michael Crichton, using notes and reference materials to finish the novel about nanotechnology after Mr. Crichton's death. Mr. Preston is the only non-physician to receive the Champion of Prevention Award from the Centers of Disease Control, and he even has an asteroid named after him that may someday collide with Mars. Please help me welcome Richard Preston.
Well, it's very nice to be with you today. Thanks, Taylor. That was great. I should mention that asteroid Preston is on a chaotic, unpredictable orbit. And there's also some possibility that if it grazes Mars, it could take a loop and hit Earth instead, which would be an explosion similar to the one that wiped out the dinosaurs. I hope that would not be my ultimate legacy. At any rate, let me see if I can get this thing to work here. Let's have it. Yeah, there we go. Well, I'm here to talk with you about emerging viruses and the Ebola virus in particular, as well as certain other ones that pose profound threats to the human species. Now, this particular outbreak of Ebola, the story begins on December 6th, around that date, 2013, somewhat more than a year ago, in a small village called Leone in Guinea. And on that day, a little boy who was thought to have been about 1 to 1.5 years old, named Emil Omunu, contracted a disease. Let me show you where Leone is. I'd love to show you where Leone is. Let's see. There we go. So we're now looking at West Africa. And the Ebola outbreak has been centered in these three small countries here. Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. I've just returned from Sierra Leone, where I'm researching a new book on Ebola. I should tell you that I'm more than 21 days after my return from Sierra Leone, and I did not develop a fever or a bloody nose, so I think I'm okay. In any event, if we zoom in a little bit, there, I think I have to point it over there. Now we get into the heart of the Ebola zone. On December 6th, this little boy in this tiny village of Measles developed fever, diarrhea that turned bloody, and he died in his mother's arms in this small village. There we are. This is Google Earth showing you the village of Measles, and I'm showing it to you from the air to give you a sense of the ecosystem in that area. You have all around the villages what was once primary forest. That's primary tropical rainforest with huge old trees, has been cleared. And these are now all fields growing cassava, which is the staple of the diet in that region. And it's slash and burn agriculture. So they plant cassava, then they let it go fallow for a few years, they burn it and plant some more. And the fields have contracted in a ring around the village, but you see that they very carefully maintain a circle of trees around their village. This is to keep the village cool during hot weather, and also to provide a regular, easy source of firewood, which they use for their cooking. And then the village is right in the center, and you can still see that there are some these are big, classic rainforest trees. These are old primary rainforest. There's still a little bit of it left. Well, that boy, if he was the first case of Ebola, and we think he was, he probably came in contact with some living organism, some life form that lives in this little patch of forest. It may or may not have been a bat. There is not good evidence that Ebola virus is carried primarily by bats. There still is just nothing but a hypothesis with inadequate evidence to prove that. And there are a lot of scientists who feel that the original host of Ebola virus, which is some organism in which the virus lives and circulates, unnoticed, probably doesn't make the organism very sick, may very well not be a bat, but may be, for example, a parasite that lives on the body of bats, a tick, a mite, or a small wingless fly. When bats live in colonies, they can get flies on them that don't need wings because they just crawl from one bat to another, biting the bats as they go. But it's all speculative. In any event, that boy was the start of the outbreak. The virus came out of an unknown host in nature and made what is known as the trans-species jump, going from the host to the little boy. Ebola virus has an uncanny ability to move from one human to another, and it's immensely destructive in the human body as it does this, and it is highly infectious. So the next person to die was Emil's older sister, who was 2 or 3 years old, and then their mother died, and then their grandmother died. In Africa, where most people don't have access to good medical care, you're cared for at home by your loved ones. Ebola virus, one of the most insidious things about this virus, and the thing that makes it the viral equivalent of a vampire, is that all viruses have a specialized way of moving from one host to another. And Ebola virus preys on the love and care that exists between human beings within families. It moves through direct contact with blood and body fluids, and when somebody dies of Ebola, they produce huge amounts of fluids of all kinds, including blood, hemorrhages, vomit, you name it. And the virus then moves, gets to its next host through acts of care and love. So today, somewhat more than a year later, the World Health Organization has recorded more than 21,000 cases and something more than 10,000 deaths. We don't really know how many people have died of Ebola because the reporting has been quite inadequate. And people in Africa if they get sick, they tend to hide their illness from the authorities. So while I was in Sierra Leone, I want to show you some pictures of Sierra Leone to give you a sense of what that country really looks like. Give you a kind of feel, if I can, give you a feel for what this country's all about. Here we go. Well, first of all, you know, a lot of these deaths initially, as in the previous 24 outbreaks of Ebola virus, it starts in a rural area in the countryside where people are close to the land and where they're presumably close to having contact with many kinds of wild things that probably live in primary rainforest, one of which is the ultimate host of Ebola. So here we have deaths occurring in the countryside, ambulances going out, desperately trying to collect people, bring them into the Ebola treatment centers. Here's an ambulance driven by my friend, an ambulance driver, Gabriel. He was so desperate getting a patient back to the hospital that he rolled his ambulance. He was okay. This is Sherman Adrasa. He's the head of the ambulance driving crew at the Kenema Government Hospital in Kenema, Sierra Leone, upcountry, right in the heart of the Ebola outbreak zone. And a couple things to note about him. One is his boots. These guys, when they were driving the ambulances, they wore boots. They also had to wear the PPE, that white spacesuit-like outfit that you've seen so much in the news. But the boots were because when patients were loaded into the back of the ambulance, they often, you know, had flooding diarrhea, projectile vomiting, fluid coming out of their bodies, and it would slosh around in the ambulance and it would run across the floorboards and up under the driver's feet while they were driving. And so by the time they got to the hospital, they were wading in boots through material that was radiantly hot, infected with Ebola virus. And a number of these drivers died. Sherman survived. And when I was in Kenema, meeting with people, there was a sense of, I could really feel it in the air, the sense of post-traumatic stress. The cases have died down now in Kenema, Sierra Leone. They haven't been recording new cases in a while. I feel like there's got to be a secret sweet spot. Maybe if I'm closer, let's see. There we go. Yeah. All right. This is the way the place looks. You've got market day. This was the first market day underway since the Ebola outbreak began. It felt to me when I was in the town that the sun was coming out after a long, dark time. People were getting back to their normal everyday life. African people are incredibly resilient. They've suffered so much, particularly in Sierra Leone, where there was a 10-year civil war that cleared up not all that long ago. And they're basically ready for anything. So, and now you see these signs all over the place, avoid unsafe burials. One of the burial practices in Africa that was a particular problem was that in Sierra Leone, in that area that had the circle around it, one of the burial traditions is that when a loved one passes away, you often spend the night with the body, sleeping next to the body. And then in washing the body, you collect the water that runs off the body in a pot. And then if it's a father who has died, the son then washes his body with that water. And then he may share the water with his children, if it was a grandfather who died. And so it's believed that some of the Ebola transmission happened through this process of washing repeatedly with the body water. Seems to work better when I'm back here. So I went off in the countryside with epidemiology teams, and this is one of the better roads in Sierra Leone. This on the maps is marked as a main highway, and you were lucky if you could get 15 miles an hour out of it. It took us about 4 hours to go 50 miles, to give you a sense of it. But some of the roads in Sierra Leone are very nice. They were built by the Chinese. And those roads you can get practically from one end of the country to the other in about 4 hours, which means that people who are sick in some village can, within a few hours on a motorbike or in a truck, get to a main hospital in a city. And this is one of the main reasons why Ebola has gone so far so fast in West Africa. It's the law of unintended consequences. The fact that the Chinese, in particular, invested huge amounts of money and were very skilled road builders. It made the country much more interconnected. Now, we live in a highly interconnected world, now connected by airline flights. And so, as we've seen in this outbreak, when somebody gets sick with Ebola, they can show up in a city anywhere in the world within 24 hours. And this is true of any infectious agent, not just Ebola. So, in effect, we all live in a village in which there are roughly 7 billion inhabitants. As I was going around Sierra Leone, you see evidence of civil war everywhere, which is one of the underlying factors in the cause of an outbreak of a major disease like this. These are 3 ladies. The lady in the center is the owner of this destroyed and abandoned house. It was shot up and burned down by marauding troops from Liberia, and she remains very hopeful that one day, somehow, she's going to have enough money to rebuild her family home. Generations of her family grew up there. Whether she ever gets the money to rebuild, who knows? But you get this sense that people are determined to carry on with enormous dignity and self-respect. Here's an ironworking forge. I bought a couple of machetes from that guy. And then this is, if you've seen the movie Blood Diamonds, this whole area is right in the middle of the diamond fields. And so I encountered lots and lots of diamond miners. They're very friendly, they're good guys. And everywhere I went in Sierra Leone, I found that Sierra Leoneans really like Americans a lot. There's a tremendous amount of warmth. And many of them have family members who have lived in the United States or who know Americans. And you find that English is spoken widely in Sierra Leone. This is a cool guy. A diamond merchant. Let me see, where is he? Yeah, there we are, the youngest bomber. So if you want to really spend a lot of time in jail, buy a diamond from that guy, and then try to fly out through the airport. They'll catch you. And you will rot in a jail in Freetown, Sierra Leone for the rest of your life. That's Sunday washing in the river. Okay, that's a sort of to give you a feel for what Sierra Leone is like and what West Africa is like. It's a vibrant place. I loved the place. I want to go back there as soon as the Ebola storm is over, and I'm hopeful. I hope it will be over at some point. I want to take my family back. So what is a virus? Well, a virus is considered by biologists to be an organism that is neither strictly alive nor strictly non-alive. Here we have an image of the classic Ebola virions displaying the classic identifying curl at the end of the particle known as the shepherd's hook. No one is really sure whether that has a function or exactly how that occurs while the virus particle is being extruded from the wall of a cell as it's being made. But when a cell is infected with a single Ebola particle, the particle has an ability to replicate explosively with dramatic speed inside the cell. Now, the little boy in Miliandu, Emile Umunu, may have been infected with as few as a single particle, infectious particle of the Ebola virus. That would be enough to start the entire global outbreak that we have witnessed. One particle of virus in one child dying in an obscure place in Africa, not recognized as a kid dying of Ebola until it was far too late. So the virus has the ability to both confuse and destroy, really wipe out the human immune system quickly. The particles begin to form, once a particle gets into a cell, they form these giant clusters that look like packed dry spaghetti around the nucleus of the cell. For some reason, they form around the nucleus. No one is sure quite why. And then as the cell becomes increasingly infected, the virus particles begin to move. They move out of the cell toward the cell wall. Yeah, here we go. And then here we have a cell which is crawling with Ebola. And then finally, the particles are extruded. They actually grow out of the cell like hair. And what's happening here is that if you look closely at one of these cells, it develops this horripilation of small bumps. And then each bump begins to elongate, coming out like a finger or like a blade of grass growing, getting longer and longer and longer. And these are the virus particles growing out of the wall of the cell. As they grow, they take the wall of the cell with them. And each one of these threads of Ebola virus is actually covered with a human membrane. That's a human membrane coming off that cell. That's one of the things that it does to protect itself. Because if the virus is covered with a membrane of a human cell, then the human immune system has difficulty recognizing that as something alien. Another thing that Ebola virus does is, there are many things about Ebola that are not understood well at all. There we are. As it grows out of the cell, another thing that it does is it creates a protein called the delta 40 protein. No one is quite sure what the delta 40 protein does, but apparently what it does is it disguises the infected cell from human immune cells, the white blood cells, the macrophages that are circulating in your blood. And your immune system has the ability to identify a cell that's infected with a pathogen, and it will then kill the cell as a way of killing the factory that's making those viruses. Well, the Ebola delta protein is like, it's like a disguise. It's like chaff being thrown out from an aircraft as it goes along to disguise to confuse the radar of the human immune system. And so that the immune cells can't recognize these infected cells as being crawling with Ebola. In addition, the Ebola virus, nobody really knows this for sure, but they think that of all these particles that you're looking at, only about 1 out of 100 of them is actually a live, or I should say viable Ebola particle, able to start an infection. The other 99 of those, on average, are dummies. They're not alive at all, and they do nothing at all except that they completely confuse the immune system. And if you think about these immune system antibodies and cells circulating in your bloodstream looking for a dangerous pathogen, if only 1 out of 100 of them is actually the real McCoy and the rest are dummies, the human immune system is never going to find that real one. Never going to knock it out. So as a consequence of this, Ebola virus can grow to extraordinary concentrations rapidly in human blood. Typical infection runs 7 to 14 days. And from, let's say, 1 infected particle in your bloodstream, by the time you die of Ebola, a droplet of your blood that would make a tiny spot on your pinky fingernail could contain between 100 million and 1 billion particles of Ebola virus, of which only 1 out of 100 is the real McCoy, is a loaded gun. The rest are dummies. They're guns made of soap, as it were. But all it takes is 1 viable particle into the next person, and the virus can move, can establish itself. Now, all viruses are like this. Viruses are opportunistic as life forms. They're parasites, and they're obligate parasites. What that means, an obligate parasite is a parasite that can only reproduce or make copies of itself inside the body of a host. And in the case of a virus, it can only make copies of itself by seizing control of the cellular machinery inside the cell, and then taking control of the proteins, the resources of that cell, and then ordering that cell to make more and more copies of the virus, to take that cell and essentially commit suicide while making more and more copies of the virus. Now, viruses like Ebola are rapid mutators. They tend to change constantly as they're replicating, as they're going through this replication cycle. They change, they mutate. They don't have a very good checking function in their genetic code, which is the molecule RNA. RNA, when it replicates, is very prone to errors. So now we have a fast mutator. And why would it be to the advantage of a virus to make lots of mistakes as it's copying itself? Well, the advantage is that viruses are opportunistic in the sense that they can suddenly shift hosts. They can move from one host to another, engaging in what's known as the trans-species jump. This is what Ebola virus is doing right now with the human species. It is engaged in a major trans-species jump. It is changing. Geneticists are looking at the changes in the virus, trying to determine exactly what it's doing as it becomes more and more familiar with the human immune system. The ultimate, if you think about the ultimate goal of life, and it's our goal as living organisms just as it is Ebola's goal, the ultimate goal is simply to establish itself as life, to reproduce, to carry on as an individual, to perpetuate our genetic code, to pour our love, as humans, we pour our love into our children, to reproduce our own generation and to carry on. It's not entirely unlike a virus. Now, a virus is not in any sense conscious. It has no consciousness, but it's biologically extremely clever and opportunistic. So, a virus's ultimate goal, and it is the ultimate goal, one could say, of Ebola virus, to make itself immortal. How does it make itself immortal? By changing species, by moving out of whatever species it inhabits and getting into the human species. The way it can make itself immortal is by establishing a permanent chain of human-to-human transmission from one person to the next, ad infinitum, without ever ending. That is the equivalent of immortality to a virus. Now, Ebola appears to be tending in that direction. The virus has not yet been wiped out in West Africa. And quietly, some experts are worrying, quietly, they can't really say this publicly, that Ebola won't be wiped out. That it may mutate, it may get entrenched in the human population, it may be with us forever. But the point is that nobody really knows. When Ebola gets into a human being, the disease is at first hard to recognize. In a place like equatorial Africa, you have things like malaria, you have really vicious diarrheal illnesses like shigellosis and various diarrheal viruses. You've got Campylobacter, and all of these things give you a high fever, and many of them give you profuse diarrhea and make you really sick and make your tummy hurt like the dickens. That's about what happens when you're starting to get Ebola. But then the classic features of Ebola emerge after a few days of infection. And they are, and these are now regarded as diagnostic clinical signs by doctors who look for this and can see it. You get, in addition to the pain, the face develops a classic mask-like appearance, somewhat swollen, sometimes with a bumpy rash called the maculopapular rash. And then the eyes turn brilliant red. This is from hemorrhaging into the whites of the eyes. Blood vessels are leaking blood. And in some cases, the rims of the eyelids, the mucous membranes on the conjunctiva, will develop tiny little droplets of hemorrhagic blood that gleam if you look closely at the person with Ebola. There's also the outreach doctors now who are going out into these towns in West Africa looking for cases. They ask people to open their mouths, and you can often see bleeding around the teeth, bleeding on the gums, and just spots of blood on the teeth themselves. That's another diagnostic sign of Ebola. And as the illness goes along, the person can become very confused, can show psychotic signs. No one is really sure why. And then you can have episodes of vomiting. The vomiting can be intense. It can be projectile vomiting. And there can be hemorrhage into the stomach, which is then cast up in the form of what's known as the black vomit. It's a granular material that has a so-called coffee grounds appearance. And then there can be profuse diarrhea. Sometimes it can look like any diarrhea, and other times it can be coal black, which is called melena, and that's hemorrhage. And in the end, these Ebola patients, from what I know, what I've been told by the doctors treating them, they can go along for a few days, and they can sometimes have good days and bad days. And often enough, they'll seem as if they're beginning to recover, but they get the hiccups. And a patient with the hiccups, almost 100% of them die. And the hiccups, when they emerge, is a clinical sign of pending death. No one knows they have no idea why this is. And then death happens very rapidly in what Ebola experts for years have been calling the crash, or the crash and bleed out. And all of a sudden, within a matter of minutes or an hour or so, the patient just goes into irreversible shock. No one knows the cause of death with Ebola, but it's this irreversible shock where the blood pressure suddenly crashes. They just lose their blood pressure and they just simply die. And that can, in some cases, be accompanied by profuse hemorrhage, not always. So I wanted to give you a sense. This organism is a kind of vampire, and it's so small and it's so inhuman. I'd like to call for a volunteer, and I want to give you guys a sense of the scale of size that we're talking about in the viral universe. We could have somebody up here to hold a tape measure for me. Anybody want to come up? Got a volunteer? Okay. Now, I have here an Ebola virus particle. Can you see this? Yeah, that's about it. I even put the little shepherd's crook on the end. So it's pretty much the scale, okay? Now I'm going to show you what this size is in relation to the width of your eyelash, okay? The width, not the length, the width of your eyelash. So, what's your name?
Micah.
Okay, Micah, would you take the end of that tape measure? And I'm going to walk it out here. We'll see how far we go. This is the width of a human eyelash in relation to this particle of Ebola. We're at 10 feet. We're not there yet. "17 feet, 20 feet. Nope. Keep going, Micah. Where are we? 25 feet. No, it's still not enough. 30 feet. There. That is the width of the human eyelash in relation to this. Okay? And the length of the eyelash would be about half a mile. Something like that. How a single one of these viruses can possibly cause such incredible devastation in the human species it's a wonder and a mystery. And it tells us, in effect, that while we like to think that we control nature, we certainly do not. And we are at the mercy of forces of nature that extend powerfully beyond our ability to control them. And I think of the Ebola outbreak in West Africa as, in effect, a biological tsunami. Here's the particle close up. And Ebola can only be studied in high containment laboratories. but since, given the fact we're human, things can go wrong even in the finest laboratories. But this is what the typical setup looks like for researching Ebola. I've been in these spacesuits and I've been face-to-face with Ebola and other organisms like it. And it's a pretty interesting situation to be in, because you feel, I imagine it's a little bit like scuba diving, except that what you have surrounding your suit is both profoundly alien and also knows your body very well. And we love nothing better than to get inside your body and to do experiments on you. Now, in West Africa, they don't have that kind of technology. This is the Kenema Hospital's biocontainment lab, which I visited and been inside. And they work with Ebola in there. They work safely with Ebola. The African and the American doctors and scientists who are working there really know their stuff. They know it better than probably most anybody else in the world today. But they're limited by funds, and they have to do the best they can with what they've got. Here's the administration office, just to give you an idea. But Ebola itself, where it comes from, is still completely unknown. But I wanted to show you something, a little bit about the environment in the tropics and in West Africa. The primary forests are being cut down. And that tree right there, I could have bought that tree trunk for the equivalent of $3 from that guy. The trees are cheap. And they're often cut down for local use, not necessarily for export to developed countries. But here you can actually see what's going on in a place like Sierra Leone. You have the hilltops are still sometimes have a scruff of primeval rainforest right there. That's never been touched, never been cut. But the cutting is moving up to the hilltops until they end up with a, just kind of a ragtop forest. And right here is a cassava field that's been planted and is growing this growing season. And then farther down the hill, what you're seeing are cassava fields that are in fallow, but will be returned to cultivation at some point. And then they always leave the wild palm trees because they're a source of oil, which is important to the economy and to the diet. Ebola virus, whatever host it lives in, Ebola is here. Ebola is not here. And it's in this line, this interface of contact between humans and primeval rainforest where this trans-species jump occurs. The virus moving from its natural habitat into a human body. But Ebola is not the only thing we need to worry about. And I wanted to extend this talk a little bit beyond Ebola, because Ebola is an example of a phenomenon, a much larger phenomenon in nature, which is the dramatically changing relationship of the human species to the natural ecosystems of the earth that we inhabit. Our population has grown dramatically in about the last 100 years. At the beginning of the 20th century, when my grandfather was born, the human population of the earth was 1.5 billion humans. Today, in my lifetime, it's 7 billion humans, and it's going on toward 10. Meanwhile, we're becoming much more concentrated in urban environments and cities, crowded together, and we're not getting good access to medical care, most of us on the planet. There are other things out there that perhaps are more frightening than Ebola, and one of them is the group of viruses known as the Morbillivirus. And you're looking at measles. Now, measles also did a trans-species jump into the human species. It's thought to have happened about 300 to 500 years ago from a virus that infected cattle called rinderpest, cattle in Africa. The cattle rinderpest, which makes cattle really sick and kills them, has somehow or other gotten into humans, and we call it measles. And now that many parents are not getting their kids vaccinated, we have a measles outbreak going on right now in the U.S. But these viruses can travel through the air, which Ebola does not do. Ebola is a direct contact virus, but the measles class form tiny, dried, powder-like particles that can fill a room this size in a heartbeat. If one person in this room has measles, then everybody in this room will be considered exposed to measles. It's a nasty disease, and it causes death and brain damage in many kids. Son of measles could be a lot worse. And then there's smallpox. Smallpox is thought to have originated in a trans-species jump, making it into the human species, the way Ebola is sort of trying, so to speak, now. Around 4000 BCE, that is to say around 6,000 years ago, in one of the river valleys of the Middle East. Here we have a village in Egypt. This is a contemporary photograph of a village on the Nile. And this type of village has not changed in 5,000 to 6,000 years. It's all the same. And where did the smallpox come from? Well, smallpox is thought to have been the worst infectious disease in human history. It killed about 1 out of 3 children who were born, typically, throughout history, once it entered the human species. It has a mortality rate of about 1/3, and it tended to infect every single child born. So parents were simply used to the idea that they were going to lose a kid or two to smallpox. It was just one of those things. Now, epidemiologists have done studies of smallpox, and they found in computer simulations that smallpox it can't spread from one person to another. It can't make itself immortal. It can't enter into an unbroken chain of human-to-human transmission until there's a human population of about 200,000 people living within a 14-day travel time from one another. So when the human species was primarily hunter-gatherers, there were never 200,000 people living within 14 days of one another. But when the agricultural river valleys of the Middle East were settled, all of a sudden you had the growth of cities and communities and people who could pass that virus back and forth, and smallpox made itself immortal. Now, it's interesting to think about the devastating effect of smallpox and measles on Native American populations during the settlement of North and South America by Europeans after 1492. Smallpox and measles were devastating to the indigenous populations. They had an extremely high death rate. Why? Well, the reason why is because the indigenous American populations settled in North and South America at least 14,000 years ago, which suggests that they came to the Americas before smallpox entered the human species. And smallpox spent 6,000 years, thereabouts, infecting people in Europe and Asia, and killing off generation after generation of children, and thus performing natural selection on people of that ancestry. In other words, kids who were just naturally, genetically a little bit more resistant to smallpox had a better chance of surviving the illness, or maybe not catching it in the first place. But the Native American populations were virgin to smallpox. And so in effect, it hit the New World, and there was no genetic immunity in that population based on the previous experience, previous natural selection. So it was just absolutely devastating in humans in the New World. One thing that strikes me is the fact that Ebola virus is absolutely devastating in humans. And they're watching it now and wondering what's going to happen to it as it mutates, as it becomes more and more familiar with the human immune system. And there's a possibility that it could become more contagious, but less deadly. In other words, if it could spread more easily from one person to another, but kill fewer, then it would be able to establish a better chance of immortality in humans. Here we have Pharaoh Ramesses V, who is thought to have died of smallpox during its early days. This is what smallpox actually looks like. It's absolutely horrifying. And here we have a genetic institute in Cambridge where they're doing research now into the genome of Ebola. They're trying to find out exactly how it's mutating, and we still don't have any clear answers on that, except that we do know that Ebola is mutating, and that every time a person catches Ebola from the last one, the virus has mutated slightly. It's every person who catches Ebola has a slightly different variant than the one before. Anyway, I'm going to close with a story about Yambuku in 1976. Yambuku, Zaire, was where the Ebola virus first appeared in 1976. There was a doctor there by the name of Jean-Francois Rupault. And he arrived at this church in this little town to find people dying of an unknown virus. And people were really scared, and Dr. Rupault was terrified because the virus appeared to have close to a 100% death rate. Dr. Rupault, on his first day there, went to sleep in this mission guest house, and everything was quiet. The hospital was deserted. In the middle of the night, a woman came in. She was in childbirth, and she was in the throes of Ebola virus. She was hemorrhaging from her birth canal, and the baby was stuck. The hospital itself was a disaster. The operating room was splashed with Ebola blood, and the maternity ward had bloody sponges on the floor, blood on the walls, and fluid on the floor. And so Dr. Rupault decided that it would not be a good idea to try to help this woman deliver her baby in any of the hospital areas. So he got some nurses together, and they brought a table out onto the front porch. It was now 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, pitch dark. And they had no electric power, but they had flashlights. And they put the woman on the table, and then Dr. Rupault examined her. And he concluded that she was about to die, and that the baby was going to be lost and would die as well, unless he got the baby out. Well, the hospital had absolutely no supplies. Normally what you would do is you would do a cesarean section, a C-section. But there was no anesthetic, no antibiotics, and he had a pair of rubber gloves that had been washed and reused, and a thin cloth gown, and there was blood everywhere. So he did a primitive surgical procedure from the 19th century. It's known as the Zarate procedure. I don't know if any of you are medical people who know what that is. But if you take your pelvic bones or hip bones, right where they join, right here, there's a thick piece of cartilage, and actually the pelvis bones are held together by this piece of cartilage, which can be cut. The Zarate procedure is just that. So Dr. Rupault took a scalpel. The woman there was no anesthetic, so the nurses held her arms, and she was quiet. She didn't scream because she was desperate to bring her baby into the world. At this point, she probably knew she was dying of Ebola anyway. So the issue of pain for her wasn't much, but the one thing that was really important to her was to bring her baby into the world alive. And so she maintained silence, held herself together, and with the scalpel, he just split her pelvis right down the middle. And then he pulled it apart. And doing that, the nurses had to pull her legs apart. And the baby popped out. The baby was covered in blood and was in breathing arrest. And without thinking, Dr. Rupault took off his mask, and he placed the baby against his mouth, and he inflated the baby's lungs gently and got the baby breathing, and then the baby cried. And then he pulled back, and his whole face, his nose, his mouth, everything was smeared with the mother's blood, the baby's blood. And the nurses were standing there in shock, and one of them whispered to him, "Doctor, do you realize what you have done?" And he said, "I do now." Like many of the people who have worked in the Ebola outbreak today, the medical workers have cast aside all thought of their lives as they just zero in to try to save the life of some patient who may not be savable. And I saw this again and again in my interviews with both Americans and with Sierra Leoneans. That when you're a practicing physician, when you're in the eye of the storm, when this incredibly dangerous, chaotic outbreak is swirling all around you, you're the only doctor in a ward full of 60 people, all of whom have Ebola, some of whom are already dead. They're lying on the floor. The beds in these wards had 3 Ebola patients per bed. So if you can imagine what that was like, people falling out of bed, and then one doctor and one nurse. You do what you can. And a number of them lost their lives in this. But I think the lesson we can take from this is that while Ebola virus preys on and thrives on the love and care that we give each other as human beings, that is also its greatest weakness. And in the end, Ebola can and will and must be defeated by the care that we show for each other, the concern and the ability to deliver care, which only we can do as humans. It's one of our greatest traits, is the ability to love. This is something that a virus can never achieve, and it's what makes us so much stronger than any virus. Thank you. I don't know how we are on time, but I'd be delighted to take some questions. Maybe people need to go.
I know some people have classes, so if you need to leave for that, but if you have time for a question.
Sure, I'd be happy to, Jen. Oh, that's a great question. The question was, the populations, the human populations that live in these rainforested areas, do they show any sign of immunity to Ebola virus? And the answer, curiously, is no. And that leads scientists to believe or to speculate that when Ebola virus breaks into the human population, it's a sudden, isolated introduction in which it goes from one human being into the population. In other words, it's not circulating quietly, and we're not seeing lots and lots of quiet, silent outbreaks where it's getting into people. Because every time it gets into people, it's really a violent, obvious outbreak with a really high death rate. But that's a really interesting question.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
I read your book in 1998, or whenever it came out, and it gave me the impression that Ebola is extremely, what's the word I'm looking for? Contagious. What my question is why do you think with the recent incidences of Ebola and our country letting the people who have that come back and us treating them, why are they downplaying the seriousness of that in the public eye? Because to me, I would think they would be more concerned. Are they trying to avoid public panic, or is there something new that they're doing that's making it less of a threat?
Well, that's a really good question. The question is about the inherent infectiousness of Ebola virus and what is the level of threat, and are the authorities playing it down? I think the authorities were playing it down initially. I think that the Centers for Disease Control had some confusing advice to give to nurses and doctors for how to protect themselves from Ebola in a clinical setting if there's a patient who's sick with Ebola. But what really happened in Dallas was that the doctors didn't ask the guy these crucial questions. Here we have the biggest outbreak of Ebola going on that the world has ever seen, and this man has just come from Liberia. You would think that in the emergency room they would simply ask the questions, which they didn't do. And that's really, honestly, that's the fault of the hospital staff. Now, you can hardly blame them in a way. I mean, in our medical settings, we're so confident that we can deal with, just about anything that comes down the line. This is a modern hospital. We've got all the technology. Well, the technology doesn't do you a lick of good if you don't know how to use it. And if you're not really practiced in dealing with, specifically with Ebola patients, which they're a whole new level of challenge for doctors. And one of the doctors that I was interviewing, Dr. John Schieflin, said to me that, when he first arrived at that Kenema hospital, he walks into a ward where there are 50 people with Ebola and there's no doctor on the ward. He's the only one there. And he's following another doctor who's been there before. And he said, if I hadn't done exactly what I was told, and he's a very experienced infectious disease doctor, he said, if I hadn't done exactly what the experienced people were telling me to do, I would be dead. So Ebola is extremely infectious. That is to say, if you aren't really protecting yourself well, you can very easily get it. But there's another question, which is it contagious? In other words, you can get Ebola really easily if you're close to somebody who has it, if you touch them, or if you have contact with any bodily fluid that gets onto a mucous membrane, like your eyelid, you could be a goner. But contagiousness is more the ability of the virus to spread rapidly through an entire population, through a country. Ebola is not very contagious because as long as you do things correctly, you can stop it. And once the American health authorities got the word, and once they understood what they needed to do to stop it, they can stop it. So I was never really concerned that Ebola was ever going to become a big problem here. It's just an awfully big problem if you have a city of 10 million people and 3 doctors. Then you've got a problem. Yeah. Okay? Well, yeah, one more, sir? I guess we'll take one.
What progress is being made on a vaccine for Ebola?
Progress on a vaccine, that's a great question. Well, and there are 2 good candidate vaccines in testing now. One of the big problems is that now that the outbreak is retreating or dying down, it's harder and harder to find a large enough number of people to run a valid clinical test on to get information as to whether or not the vaccine works. I think there's pretty good reason to believe that the vaccine is likely to prove to have some effectiveness. And there's also the drug ZMapp, which you may have heard about, which was ultimately given to Dr. Keith Brantley and Nancy Wright-Ball, who were both working with a Christian relief organization called Samaritan's Purse in Liberia. And the account that I have of Dr. Brantley is that within 45 minutes to an hour after he was given the ZMapp drug, he began to shake violently in a condition called rigors. But when the shaking was over, he was feeling better almost immediately. And he was dying at the time he was administered it. He was in the Ebola crash. So the ZMapp drug is showing a great deal of promise. And I've been interviewing the physicians and researchers who developed the ZMapp drug. And it looks like it could have application far beyond Ebola. It could be used against other pathogens, including multi-drug resistant hospital bacteria and infections. And it might also have usefulness against cancer cells. But that's all for the future. That's for more testing and development. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, one more? Yep. How about outside?
Yeah. I want the rest of the story on that document reading on the page.
Oh, gosh. Oh, yes. I can't let you hang on that one. Dr. McCall, baby. Okay. Thank you for asking that. I originally published that as a short piece in the New Yorker magazine. And the story was told to me by one Dr. William Close, who was the father of the actress Glenn Close, who grew up in Kinshasa, Zaire, for part of her childhood, while he was running the biggest hospital in the city. He was involved in the early Ebola outbreak. Bill Close was one of the big doctors involved in this. He told me that story. And then we closed this article for the New Yorker under extreme time pressure. And I realized that I'd forgotten to ask Dr. Close how long Dr. Lupol had survived after this incident. So years later, I called Bill Close up and I said, Bill, I just forgot to ask you about Dr. Lupol. How long did he live? And Bill said, oh, he's still alive. And I said, you're kidding me. I assumed that he had died. He said, no, as it turned out, Dr. Lupol was terrified, but it turned out the woman had malaria. He had dodged a bullet. But when I interviewed Dr. Lupol, he said to me he had never been as frightened in his life when he realized what he